For spinal flexion PAILs and rails, set up in the quadruped position and begin by rounding the back out. Notice that my hands are underneath my shoulders, my knees are underneath my hips, and my feet are in line with my knees and my hands. I'm tucking my chin and I'm beginning to round my upper back or my thoracic spine up toward the sky, creating a kyphotic curve and really tucking the pelvis underneath. And I'm going to hold here and I'm going to breathe. I'm going to inhale for 4 and exhale for 8, or I'm just going to try to really relax into this position. Really rounding my back out, making sure that everything is touching the ground, like my toes and my knees and my hands. Everything is nice and firm. Noticing that my fingertips are spread apart, and really just engaging here with this stretch. So after this, what we're going to do is begin utilizing the tissue that's being stretched, which is our back, and we're going to begin pushing into the ground. We're going to push the ground forward and we're going to push the ground back with our knees. So when we transition to our next stage, we're actually going to be trying to push the ground apart from 0 to 100%. So for right now, just keep holding and breathing. Just really trying to round the back out, protracting the scapula. Now we're going to go ahead and start amping up the intensity, pushing the floor forward with your hands and pushing the ground back with your knees and your feet, almost like you're pulling the ground apart. And now from here, now I want you to go up as high as you can, slowly and progressively, utilizing your back still. From 0 to 30%, from 30 to 50, and then from 50 to 100%, trying to pull the ground apart, pushing the ground forward and pushing the ground back. Now with your abs, squeeze the ground with your abs and chest. Use your abs, but keep your back rounded. Use all your muscles, squeeze, 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 and now go back to your passive stretch. You can alleviate the wrists by deviating them in ulnar and radial deviation. And before we get into extension of the back, PAILs and rails, we'll do a couple shoulder lift-offs. So if you're able to, sit down on your heels, and we're going to lift one shoulder off the ground while we're pushing the opposite fist into the ground. And we're just doing light little lift-offs here, targeting shoulder flexion. Now we're going to bend the elbows and we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to bend the elbows, we're going to supinate the elbows. Okay, palms are facing back, and now we're going to try to lift one elbow at a time. So same thing, but just with the elbows bent. So just doing some passive range lift-offs and shoulder flexion. Now we're going to find our extension. But first, we're going to segment the spinal cord from a flexion to extension. So we're going to segmentally start going from pushing the ground apart to squeezing the ground together with our abs. So slowly going from one vertebrae, starting with the low vertebrae to the mid vertebrae to the upper vertebrae, retract the shoulders, and then lastly, extend the head and neck. So now we're in quadruped spinal extension. Our hips are anterior pelvically tilted or hinge back. Our head is up. We're in full extension. Now what we're going to do is begin to hold this stretch and breathe, but we should feel a good stretch in our abs and our chest here as we pinch the ground. So as we hold here in spinal extension, just focus on your inhales and your exhales. Try to retract the scapula, noticing that my head is nice and high. I'm just focusing on my inhales and my exhales. And I'm kind of playing around with my scapula because I really want to make sure that I'm retracted here and making sure that I'm doing the right thing, making sure I'm getting the right spinal extension. And I'm going to hold this position. You don't have to move as much as me. And now from here, I want you to begin pinching the ground from 0 to 100% effort. So begin slowly 10% pinching the ground with your abs and chest, 20% to 30%, 40%, all the way to 50% effort, 60 to 70, 70 to 80% effort, 80 to 90% effort, squeeze, pinch it together, all the way to 100% of your safest and greatest effort. Keep holding, keep holding. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Now from here, keep the integrity of the spine extended as you use your back to try to push the ground apart. So now we're going to get into our rouse contraction using our back to push the ground apart instead of pinching the ground, and try to keep the back in full extension. It's going to be really hard. Do it as hard as you can, safe as you can, and relax. Go back to your passive stretch. And now we're going to segment from extension to flexion, starting with the tail and going all the way to the head and the neck. So that was just segmentally going from extension to flexion. Noticing that in my flexion I have my rounded shoulders or protracted scapula. Then from here we're going to segment from head to tail. Noticing that I'm bringing my head down and extending my neck, retracting my scapula, going mid-back all the way to low back. Okay, and then that for me is a little bit harder, and I'm going to do the same thing, opposite from tail to head, segmentally going from extension to flexion. This should feel really good after the PAILs and rails of the quadruped position in both camel and cow. And then we're going to go from tail back to head and slowly go back from tail to head segmentally, and then kind of doing a little bit of wrist work after. So after being on your hands and knees for a long time, it's going to wear away at your wrists, especially in extension. So we're going to do some wrist controlled articular rotations, making sure that your elbow is next to your rib cage, nice and glued. Notice that my shoulders aren't moving, my elbows aren't moving. The only thing that's moving is my hands here. So I'm going to do that also in shoulder flexion and trying to keep my elbows straight and trying to go through those controlled articular rotations of the wrist. A little bit harder to do it like this. You really have to squeeze the triceps and biceps and keep those elbows straight in order to do that appropriately. Squeezing the fists and abducting the shoulders and doing some shoulder axial rotations. That's going to feel good on the shoulders after being in a pushing position the entire time. And then also going through some axial rotations in shoulder flexion. So looking at the internal and external rotation of the shoulder here. From here, we're going to bend the elbow, abduct the shoulder, and supinate and pronate the elbows, squeezing the biceps and the triceps at the same time, really using all the muscles, including the abs, when we're doing this. From here, we're going to go from internal to external rotation of the humerus here, or of the shoulder, while we're in shoulder abduction. Okay, so here we are doing internal and external rotation. Sorry, the humerus is abducted. And from here, we're going to go back to our shoulder axials, but this time we're going to do it in extension. And we're finding our full range here in extension as we go from shoulder internal to external rotation, or we perform our shoulder axial rotations. So kinetically stretching those shoulders from internal to external rotation. Okay. And if this is too much on the knees, you can always do these things standing or seated. So you can always try to adapt or modify when you're working on the shoulders and back. You can always sit down on pillows and stuff like that. So from here, I'm just kind of moving my scapula and shoulder around. It looks like just kind of going through some auxiliary things before we finish up. Back to my internal and external rotation. Noticing that elbows are at 90 degrees here, and kind of finishing here with a little bit of ankle work. Getting a good stretch in my ankles after being in that position feels really good. So here I'm getting into my combat position, or dorsiflexion of the ankle, stretching here, going back and forth, just kind of seeing how this feels in this position, especially after being in that quadruped cat-camel position.